Hi everyone, my name is Bry, this is Ben, and this is our beautiful Fulica snail, Lychee. I also have two other snails, Goji and Sloe, who are back here in their tank, and today we're going to show you how to set up a giant African land snail enclosure that is perfect for the Fulica subspecies of giant African land snail. Before we get started, I would like to say that everything in this video is based off of our own experience and our own research, and that I would encourage you that if you are planning on getting pet snails to do your own research outside of this video as well. So stay tuned for more. Snail! So the first thing that you'll want to consider when setting up giant African land snails is their enclosure. First of all, you should probably think, what material do you want it to be made out of? Now, preferably for giant African land snails, you'll be looking at a plastic or a glass enclosure, because wood enclosures, although they're good for some exotic species, aren't really suitable for snails in any capacity, and so should probably be avoided. So I personally keep my snails in a glass enclosure, which are great for several reasons. One of which is that you can see your snails really clearly all the time that they're in there, which I love. I love watching how active they are and everything that they're doing throughout the day. The ones with the screen top also allows humidity to escape really easily, which can be a mixed blessing, but in terms of keeping air circulation good within the tank, they are brilliant. You can also quite easily find glass tanks, either new or second-hand. Old aquariums also make really good houses for snails, provided that they are nice and secure. They are a little bit more on the pricier side if you decide to get them new, and also a problem with them is that they can be heavy and they can unfortunately be difficult to heat correctly, but we will discuss heating later on. I quite successfully keep my snails in here and have done for the last 3 years, and I can say that glass is definitely my preference. Another type of enclosure that you could keep your snails in would be a plastic tub. Now, these can be great because they are super easy to get hold of, they're cheap often, they're really lightweight, easy to clean. The one problem with a plastic tub, I would say, is that the visibility often isn't as good, but it really depends what brand you're getting. Some of them are still see-through and brilliant, just sometimes less aesthetically pleasing from the outside. But they do retain heat and humidity very well. If you're a novice to keeping snails, a plastic tub will probably be easier to start with. It's what I started with when I first got my baby snails, and then I upgraded to a glass tank later on. So that's something else that you could consider. So next we're going to cover what size of tank that you should use. Now, first off, in the description below, I am going to link a really helpful website which lets you calculate what size enclosure you should have based on the amount of snails and also the size of their shells. It's excellent and really helpful, and it really helped me when I was deciding what size enclosure I should get. But to give you a bit more context of how I keep my snails, I have 3 Fulica snails, all of whose shells are probably around 10 centimeters roughly in length, in a tank that is 60 centimeters long by 45 centimeters wide by 30 centimeters tall. So that's roughly 2 foot long, 1.5 feet wide, and then 1 foot tall, to give you some kind of idea of how big it is. And that gives them plenty of space to move around, to interact with each other, but also to completely avoid each other if they so desire. So this size enclosure works really well for my 3 snails, and although I could keep more snails in there, I choose to keep 3 because it allows for them to interact with each other when they so desire, but also spend time apart and each have their own space. So for our next section, we are going to look at what substrate, or bedding if you like, that we should be using for our snails when we first bring them home. Personally, I would always recommend using cocoa fibre because it's sterile, it's cheap, easy to get hold of, and also, most importantly, it holds humidity very well, which is vital for your snails who need quite a humid enclosure. Now, you might be thinking, oh, but if it's just soil, why can't I go and get some from my garden? Why can't I go and get it from the garden centre? Surely that's easier. And while that would be easier, soil from the garden runs the risk of carrying harmful pests that might harm either your snails or you, and so it's best avoided. And also, any soil from the garden centre might contain fertilisers which could also be harmful for your snails, and so generally speaking is best avoided. If you know what you're looking for in a topsoil that has no fertilisers in, by all means explore that option. However, I think coconut fibre, especially for a beginner, is the best substrate to go with. So when you're putting the substrate in your tank, you want to apply a generous layer to the bottom that will cover not just your snail's body, but its entire shell. And this is vital, one, for helping your snail feel really nice and secure and giving it a way to hide itself away from view, and also giving it somewhere that it can burrow down and lay its eggs, which you'll soon realize that they do pretty frequently. Something else that you can do to help your substrate stay nice and clean when the snails are being very messy in it, because they are very messy creatures, is to add what's known as a cleaning crew. Now, this can constitute of a few different species. In my tank, I keep small invertebrates known as springtails and also tropical orange woodlice as my cleanup crew species. These small bugs are harmless to your snails and to you, and they will go about their business eating up all the snail's poop and keeping your tank nice and clean. And so I would recommend having a cleaning crew to help maintain your enclosure, making it less work for you in the long run. So our next section, moving on, will be heating. Now, Fulica species, unlike some of the other giant African land snail subspecies, can be kept at slightly cooler temperatures, which is very beneficial living in a cooler climate like the UK, because it means less effort with heating their tank. However, less effort does not mean no effort, and so how I heat my tank for my Fulicas is by using a heat mat attached to a thermostat at all times, and that is very important. What temperatures should we be keeping our snails at? Now, Fulicas are very, very hardy, which is great. And so ideally keeping them at daytime temperatures of 21 to 24 degrees Celsius would be pretty much perfect. Ideally, you don't want them falling any lower than 18 degrees Celsius. And if they fall into lower temperatures, they can then respond by hibernating, which is something that we'll probably cover another time. But hibernating snails is not the be all and end all, and it's easily reversible by upping the temperatures. So yeah, between 21 and 24 degrees C is where you ideally want to keep your tank. Now, speaking of a heat mat, this is your ideal heat source. It's a non-light emitting heat source and can be placed, as I've got mine, at the very back of the tank, or sometimes on the floor. As long as it's not coming into contact with any other surface, then you can have it either on the wall or the floor of your tank, your preference. Ideally, it should be covering around 1/3 and no more than half of the side of the enclosure that it's on, just to allow your snails a chance to get away from it if they want to and if they're feeling too hot. So reading the temperatures from your heat mat should be easy using either a digital thermometer, which you can buy from most pet stores or online, or using a heat gun such as this, which will give you an accurate digital reading of your temperatures inside your tank and will let you know exactly what the surface temperature is that your snail is moving over. So the next subject that we're going to cover is enclosure essentials. So after you have your tank, your heating and your substrate all set up and ready to go, what else do you need? The first thing that I would say that you'd absolutely need would be a nice big piece, or multiple pieces if you have multiple snails, of cuttlefish bone. Now, cuttlefish bone is effectively raw calcium, and it's essential to a snail's diet because it's the building block of their shell. Having constant access to calcium means that their shell will grow nice and healthily throughout their life, meaning a nice, healthy, happy snail. Another absolute essential for your snails to have access to is fresh food at all times. Now, snails are kind of grazers. They'll tend to eat a little bit and go away and then come back and eat a little bit more, and the bulk of their diet should be fresh veggies, little bits of fruit supplemented in here and there, and access to a protein formula once or twice a week to keep them in a nice healthy condition. Now, it's up to you whether you put the food straight onto the substrate. As I've said before, snails are messy. They don't really care if the food gets a little bit of soil on it, which is great. But if you did want to keep the food a little bit cleaner and easier to dispose of, then a nice plastic shallow food dish would be perfect. Ideally, you don't want anything too heavy duty or anything made of ceramic, because if your snail gets up onto the roof of the tank and then falls down, it runs the risk of cracking its shell, which is not good for anyone involved. So a nice plastic shallow food dish full of fresh food would be perfect for them on a daily basis. So while I'm not going to go into huge depth on snail diet, because I can always cover that a different time if people enjoy this video, what I will say is that snail mix or protein mix that I mentioned before is an essential part of their diet and effectively constitutes of fish flakes, mealworms, and other protein high ingredients. That just means that they have some level of protein in their diet. A lot of people think that snails are purely vegetarian, but in the wild they will be going over animal carcasses, over poo, over all kinds of nasty things, but also gaining some nutrients from that. So it's important to have a protein aspect to their diet, such as snail mix, which we buy from Etsy, and I will link the Etsy shop that we buy from in the description below. So the final topic that we're going to cover in today's video is enclosure enrichment. Now, enrichment is an absolutely vital part of caring for any animal, in my opinion, because it allows you not just to see the animal survive, but to thrive in captivity. Providing enrichment allows you to see behaviours that you might otherwise miss in your captive animal, and it also is so much more rewarding for both them having lots to do in their enclosure and for you being able to watch them truly enjoy the habitat in which they exist. One thing that I like to include for my snails enrichment would be small pieces of cork bark. These can also provide a really nice texture for your snails to move over and something a little bit different for them to explore in their tank, and it can also provide a really nice hiding place if you do have any cleanup crew in your enclosure, such as woodlice or springtails, because they can go into the wood and they can burrow right in and hide away during the day without bothering the snails. Ideally, you don't want these pieces of cork bark to be too big. Again, for the same reasons with the food dish, you don't want the snails, if they get up on the roof and fall, to fall onto any hard surfaces, but provided they are well rounded, slightly buried and small, the pieces of cork bark make a great addition to your tank. So another thing that you can include in your snail's enclosure is a nice shallow plastic water dish. There's a lot of controversy over whether a water dish is safe in a snail enclosure, because a lot of people raise the issue of the snails drowning if the water's too deep. And while this is an issue to be considered, I would say that as long as the water level in the water dish does not go above the snail's breathing hole, which is around the opening of their shell, then you are completely fine using a water dish in your enclosure. I find my snails using it all the time, and it can be especially useful for me as an indicator if the humidity in the enclosure is too low, because they will be spending more time in their water dish, and so I then know to up the humidity. So it can be really, really helpful having a water dish in your snail's enclosure. Another addition to your tank that you could consider would be a plastic plant pot cut in half to make a hide for your snails. These are really, really useful for providing a small, dark, safe space for your snails to go when they want to hide away and have some peace and quiet. If you fill the plant pot with moss, you can also create a really nice little humid hide in your enclosure that will serve the same purposes as the water dish and will let you know if the humidity is too low, if the snails are spending a long time in their plant pot hide. Again, important not to use any hard materials for the plant pot. A nice plastic one, easily cut in half and then buried in the substrate, will be perfect for them. So another thing that you can include in your snail's enclosure is moss. I like to use sphagnum moss in my enclosure that I've bought from a pet store. Again, ideally not taking it from the wild without treating it. but shop-bought moss is an absolutely perfect addition to your snail's tank because it retains humidity very, very well, keeps the overall humidity in your enclosure up, and also gives your snails a nice texture to interact with as they're moving around their enclosure. Who's rasping? Someone's rasping. One other element that you could include in your enrichment would be adding live plants to your snail's enclosure. Now, firstly, you must make sure that these plants are edible and that they are safe for your snails. I don't include any live plants anymore in my enclosure because when I've done so, the snails have demolished them within days, which they had an absolutely great time doing it. But for me, spending lots of time planting these plants, nurturing these plants, putting them in the enclosure, and then watching them get devoured was not a particularly rewarding experience, even though the snails had the best time doing it. So I would say you can include live plants, but at your own risk, because they will get eaten within hours, if not days. So to round off this section, I would say to make sure that anything that you put in your snail's enclosure should be free from any chemicals and free from treatment with any pesticides or sprays or anything that could dislodge and prove a danger to your snail. Natural decorations, in my opinion, look beautiful and also make some of the best enrichment for your animals, and so doing research into what you like and what you like the look of will allow you to create a truly beautiful enclosure that both you, guests, and most importantly your snails can love and enjoy for the whole time that you have them. Thank you guys so much for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, then please consider subscribing and we'll make more for you soon. See you soon. Bye!